On a quiet evening in N'Djamena, long before the headlines began to scream, and long before the diplomats began to panic, an old man named Idris stood outside his small clay house and listened to a sound he had heard his entire life, the deep, metallic rumble of French fighter jets rising into the sky. For 40 years, those engines shook his walls, rattled the dishes on his table, and cast a shadow across his neighborhood. He was told they were there to protect him. Yet every morning, he still walked on a dirt road full of potholes. Every evening, his grandchildren still studied by candlelight. And every month, he still watched the wealth beneath his feet leave the country while nothing changed at home. But tonight, the sky was quiet. No jets, no foreign soldiers, only the soft hum of the city and the steady beat of Idris's own heart. Because this week something the world once believed impossible finally happened, Chad switched sides. The so-called fortress of the West in Africa, the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Sahel, has joined the Alliance of Sahel States. A single handshake in N'Djamena has rearranged the map, rewritten alliances, and sent shockwaves from Paris to Washington. And for the first time in decades, Idris looked up at the night sky and wondered, was this silence the sound of danger or the sound of freedom beginning? If you lived through the Cold War, if you remember the first Domino Theory, then what you are about to witness will feel hauntingly familiar. The dominoes are moving again, but this time they are falling towards sovereignty, not empire. So I want to ask you directly, is Africa finally claiming the power it was denied for generations, or is the West preparing its most desperate response yet? Before we go deeper, I invite you, especially those watching from the US, from Europe, and across the diaspora, to let us know where you're listening from. Your voice matters more than you think. The morning after the silence settled over N'Djamena, the city woke with a strange mixture of confusion and relief. Mothers preparing breakfast for their children noticed it first. No sonic booms from the airbase, no swirling dust kicked up by departing military convoys, no roar of aircraft slicing through the dawn. To them, it felt like someone had quietly erased a noise they had learned to live with, the way a person starts noticing the absence of chronic pain after many years. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. That was the morning Chad officially confirmed what had been whispered in political corridors for weeks. The country had joined the Alliance of Sahel States. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a quiet cooperation, but as a full realignment, a pivot away from the West and toward a new rising center of African sovereignty. To understand why this single decision overturned decades of assumptions, we have to step back and look at Chad the way military strategists in Paris and Washington have always looked at it, not as a nation, but as a hinge. A hinge that held the door of the Sahel open for outside powers. A hinge that determined who could enter, who could leave, and who could dominate the region. Geographically, Chad is extraordinary. It touches Libya to the North Sudan to the east, the Central African Republic to the south Cameroon, and Nigeria to the southwest, and Niger to the west. That network of borders made Chad the perfect launchpad for foreign intervention. For years, French jets took off from N'Djamena to strike militants in Mali. American and European intelligence teams monitored oil fields and migration routes from its deserts. Chad was the center of the wheel, the place where every spoke of foreign influence connected. And as long as Chad played that role, the map of Africa remained predictable. Mali could rebel, Burkina Faso could protest, Niger could remove a president. But none of it threatened the overall architecture of Western control, because Chad always stayed in place. Chad was the anchor that held the entire system together. That is why the shock today is so profound. When Chad joined the AES, it didn't simply add another member to the alliance, it sealed the map. It closed the one remaining gap in the Sahel. Before, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formed a powerful but vulnerable triangle. Their eastern flank was exposed. There was always a corridor through which foreign powers could exert pressure, insert troops, or surround the new leadership in Ouagadougou or Bamako. Chad's move ended that equation entirely. With Chad on board, the AES is no longer a cluster of isolated uprisings. It becomes a contiguous belt of territory stretching from the edge of the Sahara near Libya down toward the forests of Central Africa and from the dusty plains of Mali all the way toward the Sudanese frontier. It is a landmass larger than India, unbroken, uninterrupted, and most importantly, no longer accessible to outside militaries without permission. For the first time in modern history, a vast central portion of Africa is off-limits to foreign dictates. Not in theory, not in speeches, but in hard geographic reality, and the emotion this creates on the ground is powerful. In the markets of N'Djamena, old men who once watched French soldiers march past now sit in small groups talking in low but excited tones. They know this is not just a government shuffle. They have seen shuffles before. This is a structural shift, a rewriting of the rules that have governed their lives since the colonial era. Many of them say almost in disbelief, "We never thought we would live to see this day." Meanwhile, in Paris, the reaction is the opposite. Officials at the Élysée Palace reportedly held emergency consultations. For decades, they believed Chad was immovable, a trusted outpost, a dependable ally. Losing Chad means losing not just influence but visibility. Without Chad, one analyst noted France is blind in the Sahel. No more satellite-linked bases, no more rapid deployment, no more encirclement strategy around the newer, younger leaders of the region. And in Washington, the concern is quieter but deeper. The Pentagon understands maps. They understand what it means when a hinge breaks. They understand that a new architecture is rising, one they did not design, cannot direct, and may not be able to stop. This is the main event. This is the moment the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet. The turning point did not come from a battlefield. It came from the marketplace. A few days after Chad's announcement, young vendors in N'Djamena's central market began whispering about something bigger than a military alliance. They weren't talking about troop movements or border patrols. They were talking about money, about the price of gold in Mali, the oil in Chad, the uranium in Niger, and how for the first time in their lives, all these resources might be controlled not by Paris, but by the people who lived on the land. The merchants didn't use the term resource cartel, but that was exactly what they were describing. And in their voices was a tone that had been missing for generations: possibility. That possibility is what frightened Paris most. For decades, France disguised its economic arrangements in West Africa behind the language of stability and partnership. They spoke of counter-terrorism, development, and security cooperation. But the truth was simpler. African resources flowed out, French prosperity flowed in. Uranium from Niger powered French cities. Oil from Chad fueled French industry. Gold from Mali strengthened French reserves. And the CFA franc system ensured that the profits would be trapped in Paris long before they ever reached African hands. When Chad joined the AES, that system cracked. Suddenly, the three pillars of French energy security, uranium, oil, and regional access were controlled by governments no longer willing to accept the old terms. And behind closed doors, those governments began discussing a financial weapon Paris never wanted to see, created a unified trading mechanism that could set its own prices and choose its own currency. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. If you want our gold and our oil, you don't pay us in euros. You pay us in whatever currency we choose or in physical gold. For a country like France, where nearly 70% of electricity comes from nuclear power, the thought was terrifying. Imagine for a moment sitting in the office of a French energy executive. For 50 years, contracts where guaranteed prices were low and leaders in Chad and Niger were compliant. Now, those leaders were reviewing every agreement, questioning every discount, and speaking openly about sovereignty. And beyond them, a younger generation, better educated, less afraid, was demanding that Africa stop selling its treasure for pennies on the dollar. This was the true climax of the crisis, the fear that Africa might finally begin selling its resources at their real value. But if France reacted with panic, the United States reacted with calculation. In Washington, analysts in the Pentagon and State Department pulled out old Cold War files, the same ones that predicted how nations would fall like dominoes if one ideological center gained too much momentum. Only this time, the ideology wasn't communism, it was sovereignty. American officials understood something many Europeans overlooked: ideas spread faster than armies. And the idea of an Africa no longer bound to Western currency systems, no longer forced into unequal trade, no longer open to forced interventions, this idea had a gravitational pull. They feared that Cameroon might be next, or Mauritania, or even Nigeria with its massive population and oil reserves. The moment Chad flipped the question in Washington was no longer, will the AES survive? It was, how far will this wave travel? And beneath all these geopolitical calculations was something more unpredictable: emotion. The young men in the markets were not reading policy papers or intelligence briefs. They were reading each other's faces, hearing each other's stories. They watched videos of new leaders refusing to bow. They saw images of flags raised, foreign bases closing, soldiers returning home. They heard speeches that spoke not of dependency, but of dignity. And in those speeches, they found a mirror of what they wished for themselves. This was the moment Western intelligence agencies missed completely. They monitored phone calls, tracked troop movements, examined satellite images. But they failed to hear the sound rising from the streets, a new rhythm, a new determination, a belief that something long denied was finally within reach. That belief changed everything, because once a population stops fearing the old order loses its power. And for the first time in decades, people from Mali to Niger to Chad began speaking openly, boldly, even joyfully about a future not written in Paris or Washington, but written by their own hands. This was the emotional tipping point, the exact moment when a geopolitical shift became a generational awakening. In the days following Chad's unexpected realignment, ordinary life changed in ways subtle but profound. Women carrying baskets of vegetables to the market noticed fewer foreign soldiers patrolling the streets. Shopkeepers observed that the small groups of European advisors who once gathered in cafes had quietly disappeared. Children walking to school felt a different atmosphere, less tension, less suspicion, as if the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. These small human moments revealed something deeper. A psychological shift was underway, one that no government could reverse. For many Chadians, the political consequences began with a single realization: if the foreign presence could vanish overnight, perhaps it was never indispensable to begin with. Community elders who had lived through coups, foreign missions, and endless security partnerships started discussing for the first time whether Chad could define its own future without relying on outside guardians. The tone of these conversations was not triumphant. It was cautious, reflective, almost fragile. People had been disappointed before, but beneath the caution was a growing belief that sovereignty, long considered a dream, had finally stepped into the realm of possibility. Yet with this new hope came the first signs of uncertainty. Local officials struggled to answer questions about whether new security arrangements were in place. Some feared a resurgence of militant groups searching for weak points. Others worried that the sudden vacuum left by departing foreign soldiers would become an excuse for political rivals to destabilize the country. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Western governments might attempt to punish Chad economically. Others feared covert operations designed to discredit the new leadership. In a nation accustomed to outside intervention, the mere absence of foreign supervision created both relief and anxiety. Still, the most powerful transformation unfolded at the social level. Young people long ignored in national politics began organizing community meetings, neighborhood patrols, and volunteer groups. They spoke proudly about reclaiming their streets and their future. Some even traveled to the border regions to deliver supplies or to observe new joint patrols formed with neighboring allies. The sense of participation, of belonging to a national moment larger than themselves, breathed life into a generation that had grown tired of waiting for change to come from above. Politically, the capital saw pressure building from two directions. On one side, older elites who had benefited from the former French-centered system felt threatened. They feared losing influence contracts and international backing. Some began lobbying quietly for a reconsideration of Chad's alignment, hoping to restore old privileges. On the other side, a rising wave of civic groups, youth coalitions, and regional leaders insisted that the government must never return to the old arrangement. The two forces collided in parliament, in cabinet meetings, and even in Friday prayers, where imams spoke openly about the moral duty of leaders to honor the sacrifices of past generations. One of the most striking civil consequences was the emergence of truth-telling. For decades, ordinary Chadians had known that resources left the country while little development remained, but few had dared to speak openly about it. Now, in tea houses and radio call-in shows, citizens discussed these issues with a newfound courage. Some shared personal stories, relatives who worked in mines that generated billions for foreign companies, villages left without electricity despite pipelines running nearby, farmers displaced by security zones built to protect European interests. These testimonies created a collective memory that could no longer be ignored. The political class felt the pressure acutely. Ministers who once spoke in vague diplomatic language now had to address pointed questions. Why did foreign troops stay for decades without solving insecurity? Why were contracts written in French courts rather than Chadian ones? Why did wealth not translate into public services? The people demanded answers, and for the first time the government could not hide behind the excuse of foreign partners. But the most delicate consequence was emotional. With hope came fear that the West would strike back. Older Chadians remembered how leaders in other countries were overthrown, isolated, or assassinated when they attempted similar breaks from dependency. Parents whispered to their sons serving in the military to stay vigilant. Mothers prayed that their leaders would not be targeted. Across the nation, the realization grew that freedom is never granted without resistance. And yet, even in the face of danger, the atmosphere carried a quiet resolve. Chad had crossed a bridge, and bridges once crossed rarely led back. While the streets of N'Djamena were adjusting to a new kind of silence, offices half a world away were filled with an entirely different noise alarms, hurried conversations, and late-night briefings. In Washington, senior analysts at the Pentagon spread maps across long wooden tables, tracing borders with their fingers the way Cold War strategists once followed the contours of Eastern Europe. They understood what many casual observers did not. Chad's defection was not an isolated event. It was the center tile of a row of dominoes that had just begun to move. For older Americans who lived through the 1960s and 70s, the phrase Domino Theory still carries weight. It once justified foreign wars' intelligence operations and the fear that ideological shifts in one region would cascade across a continent. And now in 2025, that same phrase is being quietly revived in the Situation Room. Only this time, the ideology spreading across Africa is not communism, it is sovereignty. Officials at the State Department voiced their concerns in measured tones. What would happen if Cameroon joined this new alignment? What if Mauritania, sitting atop vast natural gas reserves that Europe desperately needs, followed suit? Or if Senegal, with its young leadership and growing dissatisfaction toward Paris, drifted closer to the Sahel bloc? These were not academic questions. They had direct implications for U.S. interests, trade routes, military logistics, counterterrorism strategies, and above all, the stability of the global financial order. Europe reacted differently, not with strategic calculation, but with something closer to panic. In Brussels and Paris, the realization hit almost immediately. Losing Chad meant losing the interior access that allowed Europe to act as Africa's gatekeeper. It meant losing cheap uranium, predictable oil flows, and the ability to pressure governments through the CFA franc. European energy planners, already struggling after distancing themselves from Russian gas, now faced the frightening possibility of depending on African nations that no longer felt obligated to sell at discounted prices. One European diplomat, speaking anonymously to international reporters, admitted what many feared: if Africa starts pricing its resources at real value, Europe's standard of living will change overnight. That statement, though blunt, captured the anxiety rippling through European institutions. Meanwhile, in Asia and Latin America, reactions were more pragmatic. Countries long accustomed to Western dominance saw an opportunity. China, already deeply involved in African infrastructure, recognized that a more sovereign Sahel could accelerate multipolarity. Brazil and India, nations with their own histories of resisting foreign influence, watched with interest, imagining new trade corridors and alliances that bypassed old power centers. But perhaps the most important global reaction came from the diaspora. From New York to London, from Kingston to Toronto, people of African descent followed the developments through live streams, commentary channels, and breaking Africa news updates. Many felt something stir that had been dormant for generations: pride. The same pride they saw reflected in speeches from Burkina Faso, especially those delivered by young leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who spoke not merely of politics, but of dignity, memory, and reclaimed identity. For older African Americans, those who marched during the civil rights era, who lived through decolonization headlines, who witnessed both progress and setbacks, the shift in the Sahel stirred emotions that were both hopeful and cautious. They recognized the courage on display, but also the dangers. They remembered leaders across the world who paid dearly for defying powerful interests. And in this mixture of hope and vigilance, a global consensus quietly formed. Africa was not simply changing. It was awakening. And the world, whether ready or not, would have to adjust to a new map, a new balance of power, and a new generation determined to write its own story. Late at night, when the streets of N'Djamena fall quiet and the desert air cools, people say you can hear a different kind of sound, something softer than the roar of departing jets and steadier than the hum of distant traffic. Old men call it the sound of a nation remembering itself. Mothers call it the sound of a door finally opening after decades of being locked from the outside. But everyone agrees on one thing: whatever this moment is, it is fragile and it must be protected. Because history teaches a hard truth: when an old empire begins to lose its grip, it rarely walks away peacefully. Across the Sahel, there is a quiet awareness that the most dangerous chapter has just begun. Western intelligence services, unable to control the geopolitical shift, may attempt to control the perception of it instead. Smear campaigns, sudden human rights alarms, mysterious outbreaks of violence — these tactics have appeared before in other countries that attempted to break free. And for leaders like those guiding the new alliance, the threat is deeply personal. Many recall what happened to figures who challenged global power structures: Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. The memory is heavy, and it hangs in the air like a warning. Yet in that same air, there is an unmistakable sense of hope. A hope that the next 10 years could be unlike any Africa has ever seen. Imagine high-speed rail stretching from N'Djamena to Bamako. Imagine the uranium that once lit European boulevards, now powering hospitals and universities across the Sahel. Imagine a new financial system built not on dependency, but on parity, one where nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad negotiate with the world from a place of strength, not desperation. Imagine a generation growing up knowing the names of leaders like Ibrahim Traore, not from textbook footnotes, but from real progress broadcast in tomorrow's Africa news. This is the Africa the youth are fighting for. This is the Africa that elders once prayed would come. And this is the Africa the world must now reckon with. But here is the question I want to ask you, especially those of you watching from the United States, many of whom lived through the turbulence of the 1960s, the oil shocks of the 70s, and the geopolitical reshuffling at the end of the Cold War. Do you believe this new African sovereignty is finally strong enough to withstand the backlash that may follow? Or do you fear that powerful nations will once again try to crush it before it matures? Your perspective matters, because global change has never been shaped only by governments. It has always been shaped by voices, honest, steady, principled voices willing to stand with truth when the headlines distort it. So if you believe Africa deserves to rise on its own terms, if you believe the resources of the land should belong to the children of the land, and if you hope for the protection of the leaders who dare to speak this truth, then I invite you to join thousands of others who refuse to stay silent. Tell us the city you're watching from. Let the world see that people everywhere — New York, Chicago, London, Kingston, Johannesburg — stand with justice and with dignity. Write your city and add one simple word: Amen.